episode of Welcome to the next installment of Patristica. I'm your host, one of your hosts, Mark G. Bilby, along with my co-host Jack Bull and Marcus Vincent. We're joined today by Phil Tite. Phil and I have been friends. I suppose this is a poor reflection on him, but he's been my friend for 15 years or so. Done a lot of conferencing.
It's been a rough 15 years, yeah.
Yes. Phil is currently assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. And Phil has worked in a lot of areas that would dovetail both with New Testament and early Christian studies, 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, particularly the non-commodity codices and the Valentinian literature in that. He has a book with Brill on Valentinian ethics, and he's also worked particularly on the apocryphal epistle to the Laodiceans. So we might see if we can get Phil to come in on our other episodes on the Pauline letters as well that didn't make it into the canon. But we just want to say welcome to Phil today. This episode is being recorded live. We're going to do another episode that's focused on Luke 24 and an article that Phil has on that, particularly looking at the theme of heavenly food or hierophagy in that text. So we just want to say welcome to Phil. And then I'm going to turn it over to Jack and Marcus really as our in-house experts on Valentinus and let them lead the discussion about Valentinus. And this episode is being recorded live, so please bring your questions and thoughts that they can ask to anybody on the panel.
Yeah, it's super exciting to have a return to the series Forgotten Fathers, where we look at one of the early Christian figures who's been forgotten about for one reason or another. And the first episode we did was on Apelles, which was quite a long time ago. So Phil, you're the return to the series. You're the relaunch of the Forgotten Fathers, if you will. And we've been excited for some time to have a little chat about Valentinus, a figure that I don't think many people are very familiar with in the 2nd century. And so maybe you could start by just maybe introducing us to the character and giving us a bit of background about who he was and what set him apart a little bit from some of the other proto-Catholics.
Yeah, thanks, Jack and Marcus and Mark. First of all, I'm really glad to be able to be with you, and I hope my thoughts and reflections are useful. And I actually want to learn from you guys as well, and from anyone that's actually watching this live. Valentinus is really, I think, one of the most interesting and most underappreciated 2nd century Christian thinkers. And we don't know that much about him, because most of what we know, of course, as you know, is from his enemy, from the people who opposed him later on and wrote against him and the movement that he inspired, the so-called Valentinianism, Valentinian Church. And what we do know is that he was a figure that was probably born in the early 2nd century, flourished and was educated in Alexandria, may have met Basilides and worked with him. And somewhere around 140 CE or so, he travels to Rome. He becomes involved with the church there. He becomes engaged in teaching, and he develops a school of thought around himself. And he's there active for about 20 years. We know that he is a brilliant and talented individual. He writes a great deal of material, like he's writing hymns and he's writing sermons and letters, and he's engaged in philosophical speculation and ideas. And he seems to function not so much, I don't think, as a liturgical kind of figure, but more similar to Justin Martyr, in that he's kind of setting up a school of thought and engaging philosophical ideas and trying to understand what does it mean to be a Christian in his own cultural and intellectual climate. And after about, roughly around 160 or so, he kind of drops off the map, and we don't really know what happens to him. Tertullian, of course, argues or makes the claim that, he almost becomes Bishop of Rome, and he doesn't, and he gets, ticked off and takes off. But we really don't know. And we don't know what his ideas were. We don't know, how would I put it? Well, we don't know what happened to him. We don't know how he dies. We don't know if his opponents are correctly presenting him or not. So that's unfortunate. And most of the material that we have, our evidence outside of the church fathers and the heresiologists who are attacking him, is really just simply a few fragments of his writings, which are actually just preserved quotations out of context from later writers. who are really not attacking him. They're attacking the movement that developed after him. We know that he had like some really brilliant disciples and students, and they, who then furthered his ideas and developed their own schools of thought and pushed ideas forward. Ptolemy, Theodotus, Heraclion, and of course Marcus, and Irenaeus in the 180s, of course, is writing against the Valentinians, mostly the Ptolemaic and Marcosian branches of that. But whether there's continuity between Valentinus and these later forms of Valentinianism, we really don't know. And I think that's led, unfortunately, to a period of, how do you put it, questioning, speculation, and we can talk a little bit more about like the problem of the study of Valentinus. I don't know if you have questions, just to kind of stop me from talking for a moment.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one of the questions I can imagine a lot of viewers have is there any definitive things we can say about his theology that differed from what would later become known as orthodoxy, whether that be a Trinitarian, a different cosmological outlook? Is there anything that really separates him doctrinally from Irenaeus?
Actually, I would say Irenaeus would say yes. I think Valentinus would say no. And if we look at his actual writings, it really is like, I would almost say he's a part of that kind of intellectual theologizing that's occurring roughly mid-2nd century, where he is engaging in creating theology. Like, what is it? In one of the fragments, it reads, just using Layton's translation of it, Valentinus, the leader of a sect, was the first to devise the notion of three subsistent hypostases or entities in a work that he entitled On the Three Natures. For he devised the notion of three subsistent entities and three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So he's already engaging in effect, Trinitarian thinking. When it comes to, when we actually look at the fragments of Valentinus, we notice that there's not a dualistic tradition there. And there's not even an anti-cosmic view. When he talks about Jesus's digestive system, he doesn't talk, he doesn't go into like a docetic Christology. He doesn't go into Phantasium or, possession Christology. The idea that the material is, imperfect, and therefore if Christ is perfect, he can't be material. Therefore, he must only appear to be, what he is. Kind of the stuff that Ignatius supposedly is countering. Instead, when we actually look at it, he's just so perfect, right? Valentinus says that Christ is so perfect that when he eats, he doesn't need to take a crap. And so he's got so much control over his body. So it's a different understanding of Christ. And Nicola de Nenzi-Lewis actually highlighted that in her introduction to Gnosticism, which I hadn't really picked up in the past either. And I go in, I'm preparing for class, I'm reading that, I'm like, you're absolutely right. I went back to the fragment and I'm like, yeah, this is a totally different kind of Christology, which is not out of sync with other 2nd century Christians. And I think he's basically been turned into a heretic, into a Gnostic, by his opponents, and rather than through his own thinking. And I think this gets back into how we study figures like this, right? So Valentinus is often studied along certain types of mapping or models that we work with. So we have this basically two different kinds of models that control or dominate scholarly understandings, how historians view this guy. The first one is, of course, the classic binary of orthodoxy and heresy, or proto-orthodoxy and heterodoxy. And that creates almost like a sectarian, competitive, people, are in their particular groups and they're in conflict with each other. And the historian's task then is to determine who sits over into the side of truth and who sits into the side of falsehood. And at that point, we stop actually, in my view as a scholar, we stop being historians and we start being apologists. And I think that's a really problematic approach. And and that's led to all kinds of gross caricatures of understanding the ancient world, whether we're looking at like the work by Michael Williams or Karen King or Michel Desjardins or, Elaine Pagels or other scholars. we really do need to break away from that model, that binary, even though it's very comfortable for modern day Christians today. And we need to come up with a different kind of model. The other model, of course, which is very common among people like Van Unek and Kispel and Thomason and Jacqueline Williams and others, is to basically say, oh, well, he's a part of he's a founding figure. He's a great man. He founded this sect of Christianity called Valentinianism, which then flourished for the next few centuries. And so therefore, let's see how he fits in continuity with the rest of Valentinianism. And Thomason's book, The Spiritual Seed, which is probably the most significant and weighty, both physically and in ideas, study of Valentinianism since in probably the last half century or so. What Thomason does is he does a brilliant analysis of Valentinianism, but he creates his own systematic theology. And when he deals with the fragments of Valentinus, he then forces those to have to fit into what he understands as being Valentinianism. So he does a lot of comparative analysis on things where he takes what Valentinus says and then throws that over against, into the framework of looking at the interpretation knowledge, the Gospel of Philip, whatever, and then he creates a trajectory from Valentinus upward. And I think that distorts it. And I think Christoph Marchis's work, Valentinus Gnosticus, published back in the 1990s, I think that work needs a lot more attention than than it has got over the last 40 years. And that is basically to say, Valentinus is not a Gnostic. Valentinus is a Platonizing Christian. Fitting into the 2nd century, much like what we would see with someone like Justin Martyr. And so I think we need to kind of shift away from those models that present a kind of orthodoxy, heresy kind of lineage, and actually start to understand him along other models. And I can tell you a little bit more what I think how we should approach Valentinus, but I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on what I just shared.
No, I think that's really interesting, because certainly one of the conversations we have a lot on this channel is reinterpreting how Marcion existed in the 2nd century, and whether Justin views him as an evil adversary, or in some sense views him as a Christian that, though holds diabolic ideas, he's trying to wrestle with. He writes to him, he's trying to engage with him. And so again, this interpretation of Valentinus not as just the great heterodox scumbag, but rather someone we're trying to engage with, I think is really interesting. And I also think, particularly as we get to sort of the Arian crisis, we come to Marcellus, and he begins to demonize Valentinus as well as Arius alongside that. Marcus, this is obviously a big point of yours. I mean, how do you view Valentinus in the 2nd century? Do you think he suffers the same bad rap as Marcion does?
Very much. Yeah, sorry that I switched out in the beginning of Philip's talk, just because my laptop decided that the camera doesn't work, so I switched to my mobile phone. So anyway, but yeah, I think I fully agree with Philip against these kind of binaries. I mean, even the inversion that Bauer tried to do by putting then the non-Orthodox before the Orthodox, right? I think it's still a binary version, and I would agree with Philip. I think these people in the 2nd century are simply to be regarded on their own terms, whatever they were. And sometimes by reading Irenaeus, who writes against Valentinus and against Marcion, those are the two major people. He mentions a few more, but if you look through his work, the names that reappear again and again is Valentinus in the prime position, and then in the 2nd position, I think is Marcion. And when you read Irenaeus, I think there is more Gnostic material in his theology than there is in the few fragments that we have from Valentinus. So I'm not surprised that that Irenaeus is so much engaged with the so-called Valentinians, and probably he mixes up quite often Valentinus with the Valentinians that they are around at his time, because Valentinus must have died, have been dead already by the times of Irenaeus. just as Marcion has been dead, right? So he's really engaging with Marcionites and with Valentinians. And what he reports about those Valentinians have very little in the fragments. And that's why Christoph Markschies, who's a great friend of mine, ever since these early years of his working on Valentinus, I think nobody really has been able to dispute what he was doing by saying, well, if we look into the fragments, and people transmit fragments to make those links even, right? So it is already a selection of the writings of Valentinus. And if this type of a selection is the mirror which should mirror him as a Valentinian, I think that's very difficult to portray. So if we had then the non-preserved fragments or texts, I think that would even show a greater distance. Having said that, I think there's a greater distance between Valentinus and what we know from the Valentinians than what we know from Marcion and the Marcionites. So we might have a greater variety amongst the Valentinian texts, as we have them, of course, in various collections, right? And unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, the Marcionites do not seem to have been quite keen in writing. I mean, Marcion himself hasn't written anything except a letter, potentially, and then he has put together the Gospel and the Pauline letters. That we have so many writings about him. We have more writings about him than about Valentinians, and especially about Valentinus. Despite this incomparability, Valentinus has written things, of which, of course, we only have fragments. The Valentinians have written enormously. I mean, even if we only take the few texts that survived, they have written more, I think, than all the canonical writers have written. So this is one of the puzzles, right? And I think one of the big distortions, of course, is, as Philip was rightly saying, that from what point on we have a separation between so-called canonical writings and non-canonical writings. And we have baggaged the non-canonical writings into heretical writings, again, which is a very crude box, I think, which doesn't work. Even if we take the Nag Hammadi texts on their own, I mean, Nag Hammadi, for the non-introduced people, is a location in Egypt, where we found, in the aftermath of the Second World War, we found a big library. I mean, big for us, some codices and a couple of writings. But even if we just take this, these texts, they are so different in nature. I mean, they're certainly not deriving from one writer, from one school. We have Platonic texts, we have double traditions, where we have a traditional Platonic text, and then we have a Christianized text of the same text. So we have different schools coming together in the library, which is not fully consistent. But it only shows us, right, that we have to be much more careful in thinking about how we map the 2nd and the 3rd and the 4th centuries.
And if I could just jump back in, Marcus, because I really appreciate you bringing Marcion into that comparatively. That really does help, because often Valentinus and Marcion get thrown together, even eponymiously by later polemicists, right? And they're not necessarily talking about Valentinians or even Marcion or Valentinus. They're really just using them as a code word for heretic. But when I look at the Nag Hammadi material, I mean, none of them actually work in regard to, like, none of them fit into what is considered called, Valentinianism that we've been given from the Church Fathers. And most of the Church Fathers material, I mean, there's a lot of creativity and there's a lot of material floating around. They have access to material, but most of it kind of funnels through Irenaeus anyway. I mean, when you look at Tertullian's versus Valentinus, it really is just basically an epitome of the first book of Against Heresies. And when you look at Epiphanius, you're basically looking at somebody who's doing magic mushrooms, and so it's and even Hippolytus is basically based upon in building off of Irenaeus and Tertullian, and so you've got this kind of these issues that are at play. Now, if you look at Origen, on the other hand, in his First Principles, then he does refer to Valentinus and Marcion briefly, and he reflects in his own theology. He's creating his own systematic theology that's very Platonic. He's bouncing off of Valentinian material, and you see a lot of continuity between them. And where he draws the line is at the dualistic element. He's like, yeah, I mean, we're okay with subordinationist theology, and we're okay with material and spiritual and and pre-existing souls and all that kind of stuff, and he kind of goes into this, but he draws the line when it comes to the duality of God. But we don't find a duality of God in any of Valentinus's writings, like the fragments that we have. Yeah, we don't, and then scholars have been very quick to try to assign and force things to fit into, like Valentinus. Like, I haven't talked about the Gospel of Truth, and we could even throw the Treatise on Resurrection in there, because when these texts were initially found and were being made public in the 1950s and 60s, the initial reaction was, oh, this is a beautiful text. It must be the Gospel of Truth that Irenaeus and Pseudo-Tertullian talked about, and oh my God, we finally have a major writing by this great heretic, and it's beautiful. And then we read it, and it's like, oh wait, it actually doesn't fit into Valentinianism at all. Even the closer you get to a demiurgical figure is plane, or error. And to be quite frank, that's not the demiurge that we find in book 1 of Against Heresies. And then the Gospel but early on, I mean, like initially, even the Treatise on Resurrection was initially assigned to Valentinus's authorship. That quickly got dropped, and most people don't even know about that in scholarship even today. But it got quickly dropped. But the Gospel of Truth continues to be assigned to him, despite efforts by myself and others to say, look, this is wishful thinking. It's based upon, the idea that, the incipit of that text, talks about a Gospel of Truth, and Irenaeus says that the Valentinians have their own gospel, right? A Gospel of Truth. And how audacious this is, right? And this is like in the whole canonic, his Irenaeus's agenda of saying, there's only 4 legitimate Gospels. And then in Pseudo-Tertullian, it says that, Valentinus had his own gospel. And so we take these bits and pieces, we throw it together, and we say, oh, this must be Valentinus' gospel. The problem is, Irenaeus says this is a recent production. It's audacious. It has nothing to do with the canonical stuff. It's, and even the word and none of that fits, because it more likely would have been, if there was a written gospel, it would have emerged from his disciples, not from Valentinus himself, because it's recent and it comes from those who are his followers, not from Valentinus directly, at least according to Irenaeus. And and then you look at the actual text itself, and it's pretty banal and pretty acceptable, which led Harold Attridge to make the argument that it's an exoteric text geared towards converting or drawing people into the Valentine movement, which makes absolutely no sense when you look at page 32, where you have a parenetic subsection addressing insiders to basically live moral lives and to be involved in the missionizing work of the Father and the Son and the Spirit. And so I would say that we can't see that as being coming from Valentinus, but it's a lot of forcing that goes on. Right now, getting back to the mapping issue, right? If we get rid of the map of saying, okay, we have the heretics and we have the proto-Orthodox, and if we distance Valentinus from later Valentinianism and try to look at Valentinus on his own terms, then I think the best way to look at this is not in fixed binaries that reflect modern theological controversies, but rather to look at it within the context of the 2nd century. The 2nd century is an amazing period of intellectual, artistic, literary creativity. It's an explosion of thought. It is a brilliant period across the Roman Empire. It's what we call the 2nd Sophistic. And I think if we're going to look at someone like Valentinus, I think it's important to look at him within the context of the second sophistic. And we need to look at him as basically part of a movement among Christians in the 2nd century who are turning around and saying, what does it mean to be a Christian? And the different answers to that come through relationship, right? So instead of looking at sectarian group identity, I think what we need to do is kind of look at instead identity formation through interactions. And identities are basically how we understand ourselves through our interactions with others and their perception of us. And if we look at it that way, then Christian identity is not about having a membership card like to a Baptist church or an Episcopalian church or a Methodist church or whatever. It is instead the answer to that question, what does it mean to be a Christian in this context? And I think Christians in the 2nd century, as they're figuring out what it means to be Christian, as this movement's emerging in the 2nd century and taking form, they come up with different answers. Some of them, they're like, we have to be truly Jewish and we have to really stay true to that. Other ones are like, we need to remove ourselves from Judaism. Other ones are like, we need more charismatic leadership. Other ones, we need more centralization. And I think one of the answers to it was, let's relate this to the intellectual, philosophical, scientific worldview that dominates our world. And that is really the 2nd sophistic. It's, Pythagorean and Neoplatonic thought or emerging Neoplatonic thought from Middle Platonism. It's all of these ideas that are coming out. And it deals with Stoicism, of course, which becomes very dominant in the 2nd century, and moral discourse. And I think Valentinus fits into that. If you look at fragment 1 of Valentinus, he talks about, Adam, the primordial figure, and the primal Adam from the heavenly world. But he also talks about how he has Frank's, he speaks out. How was the translation of that? Let me actually look at a translation of that. I have it here. I can just read it off. It says here, and fear, so to speak, fell over the angels in the presence of the molded form when he spoke great things greater than his molding should have allowed, on account of the one who invisibly placed a seed of superior substance with him and in him, and who spoke with boldness, right? And then it goes on, right? And it's talking about Adam. And if Valentinus is talking there, the word for speaking boldly is parrhesia, frank speech. And I think that is really a moral philosophical domain, as Ismo Dunderberg has nicely pointed out. And so I think, what is Valentinus doing? He's basically engaging in moral philosophizing, which other people in the 2nd century would have been doing. Now, what does that mean if we look at, away from kind of sectarian group identity, and we kind of follow my mentor, Fred Wissy's work, where he says, maybe this is about floating ideas that people are drawing upon rather than set, sectarian groups. And I think, Fred is correct at that point. When I was his doctoral student, I didn't actually agree with him. I do now. So I hope he appreciates that. But when I look at that with Valentinus, I think that means we can realign him within broader frameworks. Like, he has a lot in common with Justin Martyr. He comes out of Alexandria, right? So maybe he's like a proto or early form of the Alexandrian Caesarean school. He really fits into a form of Christianity that, incorporates people like Justin, Origen, Clement of Alexandria, Pamphilius, and later Eusebius. And that's where Valentinus needs to be understood within that context. And if you understand that context, you can see why somebody like Irenaeus or Tertullian would not like him, because they wouldn't like these other approaches to Christian theologizing anyway. And I think that allows us to have a more dynamic, interactive understanding of Christianity in the 2nd century. Now, that approach, that modeling, that mapping of Valentinus is not very useful for modern Christians who want to say, here is truth that goes all the way back to Jesus, and through his disciples, and then through the bishops, and then the martyrs, and up to today, and to my particular sectarian theological understanding of the world. it doesn't fit in nicely with that. But but the historian's task is not to acquiesce to people's personal faith and modern theological interests, is to reconstruct and understand what was going on in the past, regardless. And I think this dynamic approach is far more interesting and far more useful for understanding Christianity within the intellectual climate of the 2nd century in the Roman Empire. And, as you know, Christianity in the 2nd century is really emerging in the 2nd century. It's a creative period. It is a period where Christians are looking around and saying, what does it mean to be me? What does it mean to be us? And they're coming up with different answers, and they're engaging. It's creative, and they're reimagining people, right? I mean, like, you work on Marcion and his letters of Paul. And I know, Mark, you've worked on a lot of this stuff, and we've had a lot of conversations. Paul is actually more important in the 2nd century than the 1st century, because he's being reimagined. His writings are being edited, expanded, interpreted, circulated, and then venerated almost. And we have other creative things that are going on with that. And I think this, that's part of that creative, wonderful, exciting dynamic that's going on. Valentinus should be studied alongside of Lucian and Plutarch, more so than somebody like Ignatius or Polycarp. And I think that's where we need to be going. And I've got some pushback when I've mentioned things like this, not as overtly as I am today. But I remember on a Facebook group, I'm not sure if you guys are a part of it. It's the Apostolic Fathers. It's one of the Apostolic Fathers ones. And there's a lot of very conservative tones that are in there, even though I'm really glad the Apostolic Fathers are finally getting studied more seriously. But I remember I whimsically posted about a year or two ago. I said, about including things in the Apostolic Fathers. And I said, well, why aren't the fragments of Valentinus being included? And somebody came back and said, I don't think he's ever been included in the Apostolic Fathers. I said, that's the point.
But that we need to know. I mean, the Apostolic Fathers is a concept from the 17th, 18th century. Probably it goes back to if we want to take this Codex Hierosolymitanus, then it might be from the 12th century, right? So not by name. But I think it's this tendency that the story about the first 2 centuries are still written broadly along the lines of Irenaeus. So Irenaeus is the informant, which has been picked up by Eusebius and which has materialized in our school books today, right? Unfortunately. And maybe that's also one of the reasons why I think one of the big problems why we have got that picture from Irenaeus is also because we have placed and also separated the 1st century for the holy writings and the 2nd century for the less holy writings and the heretic writings, right? Whereas my claim for the last 15 years now is that it appears to me, at least, that all these writings, including the canonical or later canonical writings, have been produced in the 2nd century. They are all part of that second sophistic stream. And we haven't mentioned, for example, people like Ptolemaeus. We haven't mentioned people like Heraclion. I mean, we don't have anybody who says anything about these Gospels in the 1st century. Nobody. We have no fragments with nothing. Now one can say it's an argument from silence. We've talked about it the last days about this. But if we talk about what we've got, we have enough to talk about the 2nd century. And in the 2nd century, we have our first commentators. And the first commentators we ever know about Gospel writings is a Valentinian. It is Heraclion. It is, by the way, it is a chap who is highly intelligent. He's so intelligent that Origen, by writing his commentary on John, makes use of this commentary and just tries to better it. Whether it is a bettering is another question. More interesting even is that the patron who paid for the writing of the commentary of Heraclion is the same patron that pays later Origen again. So it's so interesting to see these intrinsic dynamics, and these people were not separated yet. These people were working together, thinking together, living together, exchanging letters, and just talking to each other as we do today.
Exactly. And I think you're absolutely right. And it's a much more dynamic period in history with a lot more interesting ideas being bounced around. I think things may start to solidify more into like group like identifiable groups, and mostly geographic and somewhat theological when you hit the 3rd and 4th century, and largely as a reaction to crises like the Decian and Valerian persecution, and then the so-called Great Persecution. But earlier on, it's a free for all because these people haven't figured it out yet, right? And I think Bill Arnell at the University of Regina is absolutely right that Christianity is a 2nd century religion, maybe late 1st century, but it's really 2nd century movement that occurs, and I don't think the people that are in these groups even know exactly what it means to be a Christian. They're trying to figure it out, and the Gospels themselves are being reworked, and the letters of Paul are being reworked. Whether we go to an extreme view of like we take Marcion's letters of Paul, and we see those as being kind of like the earlier versions that are then being expanded upon in the 2nd century into the so-called canonical letters, or we look at it as just them being edited, merged together, the traditional New Testament approach like Philippians and 2nd Corinthians and whatever, and interpolations. But even if we say Paul wrote everything there, except maybe the pastorals, because nobody with any common sense would actually say Paul wrote those. What we actually have going on is the letters are being edited, brought together, circulating, and being reinterpreted, and then we have new letters being written that are being created. We have fictions that are being created, and those fictions are not non-canonical. They include canonical materials. It includes pastorals. It includes probably Colossians, maybe 2nd Thessalonians and Ephesians. It includes the expansions on the letters that we have. It includes the book of Acts, possibly even the Gospel of Luke. If we start pushing that up more into like the early 100s, with the redating of Acts, then I think that results in a redating of Luke. At which point, what are we really studying from the 1st century? Well, really, we're not studying the 1st century. I'm going to be teaching New Testament here at UVA in about a week and a half, my summer course, and I really don't know what I should do. I'm probably going to run the traditional Intro to New Testament stuff, right? It's an introductory undergraduate course, but I keep coming back and I think, wait, should I really just be dismantling 1st century Christianity and just teaching the 2nd century here? And I'm struggling with that, in my Rise of Christianity course, which I teach here, so the first 4 centuries of Christian history, I tell my students, look, it's an incredibly diverse period with a lot of creativity, a lot of play, a lot of reimagining that's going on. But I also tell them that history is not a series of movements and ideas. It is actually a series of responses that create identities and group identifications, which are very fluid. And this is getting back to Eric Rubelard's wonderful work on Christian identity in the 2nd to 4th century or 5th century. And I love his little book. It's absolutely wonderful. And I use it. And I use it in my work on the martyrdom of Julius the Veteran to look at 4th century responses to, Christianitas and Romanitas and relating those two things. But one of the things that Rubelard points out is that identities are generated through moments of interaction, and what is most relevant and most useful within the context, right? So one day it's really great to be a Christian. Another day it's really great to be a Roman. It's easier to do business and not die when you're a Roman rather than a Christian, let's say. And so I tell my students, history is a series of moments, like a social gravity well is the metaphor I use, which draws people's attention. And the greater the attention, the greater the interest people have, the more attraction they are to it. And then they have a reaction to it. And out of that comes their identities and their understanding of who they are in that time. And then they, in order to create those moments later, other moments of identity activation, they reach back into time and they create social and historical memory. And I think that's exactly what's happening in the 2nd century. And that's how they're using the 1st century stuff, right? So they're reimagining it. Even like Valentinus, there's the idea that he goes in a lineage, right? And that he was the student of Theudas, who was the student of St. Paul, who of course is basically the apostle of Christ. And so you've got this kind of lineage, right? Apostolic lineage. But that tells me very little about Valentinus. That tells me, because it's more Eusebian in some ways, and it's framing. It tells me a lot more about the reimagining the function of Paul in the remembering and the reimagining of Valentinus. And I think as historians, what we need to do is look at that as rhetoric, not as history. And then we need to then go in and dismantle it to better understand what really was going on and who these people were. Your comment about the Apostolic Fathers is relevant, because you're absolutely right. I mean, I forget who the scholar was Sweat or something like that, a classic old history of early Christianity. And he presents it as like the age of the apostolic age, and then the age of the church, right? And that feeds, and that they're good, well-meaning people in the early second century, but they didn't have the spirit and they didn't have the connection to Christ, and therefore they kind of lost it. And of course, that feeds into a Protestant versus Roman Catholic polemic, where Protestants are like, this was the downfall of the church, right? This is when we Catholicism kicked off, and thank God we finally got Martin Luther and John Calvin, after roasting Huss, and it's like, that's totally anachronistic and does not understand what's going on in the second century, or even the third century for that matter. So I would love to see Valentinus to be brought back into conversation with Christianity as for what he really was, and that was a Christian who's trying to figure out, what does it mean to be a Christian in the second sophistic? And that's the exact same questions that Justin Martyr is asking in his first apology. Exactly what Clement's asking. That's exactly what Origen is asking. That's evidently what Pamphilius was asking, but we don't really know much about Pamphilius. That seemed to be actually what Eusebius, even in his ecclesiastical history, was asking. And though he's also then later in his Vita of Constantine asking other questions like, what does it mean to be a Christian in, post 325 or 324? And those are the kinds of questions I think we as historians should be asking, not is Valentinus a heretic and how does he deviate from Orthodox theology? Orthodox theology doesn't exist at this point.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if we even can see these kind of genealogies, I mean, that's the typical nature that develops at the latest in the second century, and which applies to Jews. I mean, the rabbis say, oh well, that's the ancestor of the ancestor of the ancestor, right? And it's school formation, right? And in very similar ways, we have that amongst the Christians. Interestingly, when Clement says the people who, after the Second Jewish War, move around, and end up in Rome, he says one of the oldest, or the oldest of all, is Marcion. Valentinus seems to be a slightly younger generation compared to Marcion, but he must have been an enormously influential person. I mean, to attach his name to a variety of writings later and to a variety of people, he must have been an inspiring teacher wherever he was.
No, I agree.
Such a lot, right?
Yeah, I think Valentinus was a brilliant thinker, and I regret that the polemics of history have resulted in us losing what would have been probably one of the most rich corpuses of writing, early Christian writings and Christian philosophy that we could ever have had. Imagine if we only had 7 fragments or 7 quotations, roughly, from Origen, and that's all we ever had of Origen, outside of distorted polemics about his life. Or even Athanasius, who's nowhere near as brilliant as Valentinus or Origen. We would have lost so much. And it could have happened to Origen because, as you know, by the end of the third century, the second half of the third century into the fourth century, the Origenist controversy kicks in, right? And is mostly because of his subordinationist Trinitarianism. But he's presented in a way like it's like, where he's presented as a heretic, and even Eusebius has to step in and defend him, while also trying to create some distance from him, and so it could have happened to Origen too.
And look,
imagine if Valentinus had been reinvented or reclaimed by third or fourth century Christians, how much richer our understanding of Christian philosophy would be.
And I think people like your friends from the Apostolic Fathers, right? They hardly see what chance makes in history. that we have an apostolic father like Justin Martyr, and that we have Irenaeus, is such a random event. I mean, we have almost lost Irenaeus entirely in Greek, and if we had not found him in a Latin translation and a bit of Coptic and a bit of Armenian, right? I mean, it would have been lost. His second work, the Demonstratio, we only have an Armenian. And with Justin, I mean, if we had not this one manuscript from the high Middle Ages and modernity, right? We had not a scrap of paper for him. So apostolic fathers, I think, disappear in the air if we look at it historically, and that's why it's I think, to me even, it's unimaginable, right, that we have lost a Valentinus and then boxed him in addition, right? Having lost him, and then we say, oh, he's the arch heretic. I mean, it's nonsensical.
It is totally nonsensical, and it distorts our understanding of what was going on and what these real people in real life were actually doing, and. You know, and just on another comment though, on the idea of him being starting a school of thought, a philosophical school, there's been pushback on that. Thomason, in his book The Spiritual Seed, and in other writings, he's tried to create a distance from that, and I understand why he's doing that. And he's trying to talk about the ecclesia rather than, you know, the school, and I think part of that is because. Some of the heresiologists have used the idea that, you know, they had a school of thought, a secret school where they taught heresies, and, you know, and practiced horrible rituals which have nothing to do with Christian orthodoxy, and so by bringing him back into the church, as it were, that kind of is an attempt at reclaiming him, or resituating him. But I think, you know, in our pushes it too far, because when I look at the actual Valentinian material, like I look at the interpretation of knowledge, right, which I would date to, you know, circa, you know, 200 or so, possibly contemporaneous with Irenaeus or shortly thereafter. It's a beautiful text. It's incredibly fragmentary. We only have about 10% of it from Codex 11, I think it's Tractate 1, and it's. But at one point, it has the idea of an antithesis of two different types of teachers: the teacher of life and the teacher of death, and then it talks about the two schools, you know, the scholae, which I would translate that, like everyone else does, as a school, given the pedagogical framework, right? And it's strongly moral. Like my old article on that text, and also in Valentinian, my book, you know, on Valentine ethics, I argued that it's a paranetic work, right? And also my more recent article in JBL, I argued that it's paranesis, right? Moral exhortation. And that, of course, is the purview largely of philosophers, moral discourse. And I think that Valentinus, I think, did start a school. I think he had a school. I think he just like Justin Martyr did, and you mentioned Ptolemy, and Ptolemy builds on what Valentinus did, and he's just as brilliant. And thankfully, we do have at least one major work from him, his letter to Flora, preserved in Epiphanius. It's one of the few things that we can actually trust from Epiphanius, it seems. But that letter, if you look at it, again, it's not Valentinian, it's not Gnostic.
No.
Not at all. And if you put that text within the context of the Second Sophistic, then that makes more sense too, because he's writing to a woman. Right, I need to write an article on this. I was talking about this actually at a Second Sophistic conference here at UVA I was a part of a few months ago. But with Ptolemy, he's talking to a woman, Flora, and encouraging her in her education, training her philosophically about the nature of God and the nature of the universe and so forth. Yeah. And then he turns around near the end and says, you're on your way to learning. I can teach you more. You're not quite where we are. And that reminded me very much of what I read in Plutarch, right? And also in the Gospel of Thomas, for that matter. I'm going to be incorporating that into my piece. But the idea is that women are silent in philosophical contexts, like the symposia, largely because they're women, and they have not attained the perfection or the moral height, as it were, on moral ladders, to use Dundenberg's idea metaphor, of becoming male. But they're not quite at the female level either. They're in transition. And I think, by looking at Ptolemy through that lens, we can actually start to see, oh, he's guiding one of his disciples and giving voice to one of his disciples, who's a female, to move her pedagogically forward. These are teachers. These are philosophers. And Valentinus and Ptolemy, I'm not sure about Marcus, but Heraclion, definitely, all of these people belong in the milieu. If you're going to clump them together in a category, then clump them into the category of Platonizing Christian philosophers. And then you start studying them along with Justin and Origen and Clement and others. And then you end up with a really dynamic process. And then when you look at the conflicts that emerge, we get a totally new perspective. Tertullian is not, look at it. Like, Tertullian is attacking not just simply what he sees as heretics. He does, obviously, but he's attacking he would attack Origen, I'm sure, or Clement. His understanding of Carthaginian theology flies way in the face of the more open, creative, philosophically oriented theologizing that we see emerging out of the Alexandrian Caesarean school.
And he's attacking Rome, the Roman Church, right? Which he has left at the end. When he's writing, and we should forget that, when he's writing his books against Marcion, it sounds that he is attacking Marcion, but in fact, he's attacking the Roman Church, because at the same time, he has left the Roman Church in the meantime, right? Because he has joined these ideas, at least, if not the movement, but at least the ideas of the new prophets, yeah? And he thinks about the Romans as the psychics, the people who are left behind, because they are not the spiritual ones, yeah. And to him, Marcion is a representative of this kind of a nonsense rejecter of this kind of new prophetism and an upholder of the Roman Church in a way. In another way, of course, the Roman Church becomes still the representatives of the apostles, and so Tertullian switches between whichever way he needs it for his argument, right? But I fully agree with you. We have to do with schools in the 2nd century. And most of the scholars that we have, with few exceptions, and those few exceptions are people like Tertullian, right? Who don't seem to be attached to their own or another school, who are freelance people to some extent, yeah? And or people like Irenaeus, who have derived from a school, but then entered in some kind of an institutional environment. But the people who are in the schools, they appreciate each other. And they, like Clement, Clement has a high regard for all these kind of Gnostics. He even, claims to be a Gnostic himself. So at this time, I think, Gnostics is no pejorative term. It's still talking about people who are teachers, who are people who are looking for insights. And most of the insights are not just intellectual, it's ethics, as you rightly say.
Yes, which is very much what's going on in the 2nd into the 3rd century. It's very much, philosophizing is really about ethics at that point. And that's probably a strong influence of Stoicism. And in the study of Valentinianism, I think that until the work by Michel Desjardins, Ismo Dunderberg, and myself, as 3 people that are interested in this topic, I think ethics have been overlooked in Valentinianism, largely because we've been working with this idea of a stereotype of what is Gnosticism. Gnostics aren't supposed to be interested in ethics because you're saved by nature. You're saved by, the fact that you have this pneumatic aspect or spark in you. And all you need to do is liberate that through ritual or meditation or through whatever, not through ethics. What you do with your body is irrelevant. But then you actually read the text and you're like, no, ethics is all over the place. And then, I took that work from Michel's work on sin and Valentinianism. And I was like, hey, it's not just the presence of ethics or the concept of sin. It's also, there's a hortatory aspect to this. And that means that we need to look at that within a philosophical context. And the way these texts are designed to shape and to facilitate ethical formation. And then when Ismo came up with his work, especially, Gnostic Morality Revisited, this book, I mean, he's mostly known for the Beyond Gnosticism book, but I look at him like, there he starts to look at how, if we look at moral philosophy in the 2nd century, then a lot of this stuff starts to pop up and makes a lot of sense, right? About moving from, vice and moving upward towards virtue and being liberated and free from, from the constraints of emotion and so forth, negative emotions, mostly like anger and hatred and fear and stuff like that. And also moving towards painlessness, working on Stephanie Cobb's wonderful work on suffering and perseverance in early Christian martyr text. She's one of the most brilliant scholars I've ever met in early Christian martyr studies. And I would say, if you guys were talking just before we started about the Gospel of Peter, and which is probably early 3rd century text, that little fragment, and everyone's talked about whether it's docetic or not. And again, I've got like tons of research material I need to write out, but I would say that fits into the moral formation. Jesus is on the cross, and he doesn't feel pain. That's not because he's a phantom. No. It's not the laughing savior motif. It is literally, he is perfect. He is physically, morally perfect. And that's exactly what Valentinus is talking about when he talks about Jesus's, digestive system. He's morally perfect. He's the perfect philosopher. And even if you look at figures which are not really philosophers, like, Polycarp, and the martyrdom of Polycarp is clearly a 3rd century text, writing about a 2nd century event. And I would go beyond Candida Moss, and I would push that more toward the middle, 2nd half of the 3rd century, given the flight of the bishop motif that you find with Cyprian and others. But in that text, he's being revamped as basically a new Socrates, not just a new Christ, but a new Socrates, which is, of course, a classic move in 2nd and 3rd century philosophical circles. And Christians are just doing that because, well, they're doing philosophy. And philosophy is the purview of ethics and morality. Religion wasn't. Religion was about giving proper honor to the gods so they don't screw you over. It's reciprocity. Christians and also emerging formative rabbinic Judaism, I think, are and even cynicism for that matter, they're merging, philosophy and religion together. And I think the Valentinians, Valentinus in particular, is a perfect example of that. He's merging, and some people don't necessarily like how he merged, but they didn't like how Origen merged.
But primacy, I think, has lies with ethics. That's the key.
Yeah. I wondered then here if we could reframe the canonical literature as almost textbooks, something like course readers that are diverse, that can be ordered in different ways, that might have different forms, right? So we were talking about the Gospel of John and Heracleon being the earliest commentary of that. We only have that residually living on through Origen, but was John something like a philosophical textbook for this one, person that in the Valentinian movement? I'm also just thinking here that, the usual framing following Irenaeus is that the canonical texts come out, they're singular, they are stable. John is written by one person in one moment of time. Luke is written by one person in one moment of time. They're apostolic. But if you really dig into the early commentary stuff, like when Origen is commenting on Luke and on John, he will mention these people, often anonymous. They'll say, some people claim that this passage was falsified, this passage was removed. So I know the particular story of the thief on the cross. So this comes up both in Origen's commentary on Luke and his commentary on John. They're almost identical. And it may be referring back to the Marcionites. He doesn't mention them in this passage, but Origen's attesting to pluriform versions of Luke, some of which have the story of the thieves on the cross and some of which do not have the story of the thieves on the cross. And where you get that, and this also goes with Irenaeus's sort of genealogy of scripture, right, where he he says that the Valentinians are the ones who are uniquely and obsessively focused with John. The Marcionites are uniquely and obsessively focused with Luke. We're the special ones who can bring all four together. But I wonder if we can also, starting with teaching philosophy as the primary sort of nest out of which these materials come, and then realizing that the canonical texts are not, I think the usual framework for, like Tatian, for instance, is even calling it the Diatessaron, presumes that there are these four canonical things and that they were all harmonized. And so harmonization becomes the key to interpret the 2nd century, where it's not really harmonization, because his concern is not that there are four stable texts and he has to reconcile them. That's not the program. It's much more eclectic and pluriform, where certain things are being left out, certain things are included, certain things are doubled, certain things are sequenced, right? But it's not necessarily presuming a stable canonical form of all of these texts. It's much more that Tatian's putting together his sort of one of his philosophical foundational texts. But in all these Valentinian schools, you have the same thing happening. And in the Marcionite school, you have the same thing happening. And Irenaeus is doing his own thing. So the Gospels were not necessarily, I don't know, I want to say like sacred, performed, and stable texts, but they might have been something like a course reader within these early philosophical movements. Is that a helpful way of framing this potentially?
I think it is, actually, and it just reminds me of that new gospel fragment that's been published from the Acarencus collection, which is famed mostly because it merges Gospel of Thomas with canonical material, and people are like, oh, what does that mean? And I think what it really means is what you just said. These are fluid texts. They're traditions that are being passed on and being engaged and actively, used. Now, one thing that you mentioned, though, Mark, that I really like is not just to simply see, are these texts stable? Are they, are they in their final form, or what is the proper genre? But you're actually asking a really important question. That is, what is the function of these texts? How are these texts being used? Are they being used for worship? Are they being used for ritual processes? Are they being used for moral formation? Are they being used as pure speculation? Are they just student exercises? Wouldn't that be horrible for 2,000 years of church history if we finally found out that the Gospel of John was nothing more than a school exercise in interpretation? I'll write that.
So
book
it comes across this connects a little bit with your hierophagy work, but there's a symposia sizing of these texts as well. When you look at so the Marcionite forms, for instance, there's not a big emphasis on the symposium. But in the canonical versions, you keep getting these meal settings and these philosophical dialogues that are happening in meal settings. And to me, it's really framed within a philosophical, maybe somewhat aristocratic, notion, because education is a leisure activity. We assume that education and literacy is for all today, but in antiquity, it was mainly the province of the elite. With slaves, of course, as well as literary slaves. But within all these texts, they are in a symposium setting, in their canonical form. It's kind of self-reflective, I would say, in that way. Is that a valid way of contextualizing Valentinus and his later heirs?
Oh, absolutely. I think we can easily situate Valentinus as being part of that kind of elite 2nd century philosophical speculation that's going on in Christian churches. And he's part of a dynamic process of people debating and contesting and so forth. For instance, you mentioned, instead of treating these texts like the 4 New Testament Gospels as fixed canonical works, which are being debated or merged or whatever, right? Like Tatian's Diatessaron and so on. I think instead of looking at it as an either or, I think we need to look at it as a process that throughout the 2nd century, we have this move among some Christians towards greater centralization and authority and creating boundaries that cannot be transgressed. And we hit that, right? Because there is conflict going on. And Jeffrey Smith, he has his Guilt by Association book is an amazing study of that with the heresy catalogs that emerged in the 2nd century. But when we get to Irenaeus, we get the rule of faith. We get this polemical approach. We get this canon of sacred text, or at least authoritative text, that are now standing in a certain relationship, which is basically, a collection of Paul's letters and the four Gospels. And if and I think that's a rhetorical move on his part. That's the outgrowth of an entire century, or 2/3 of a century of this kind of contestation. So the canonical material, canonization, is not where we begin in the first century. It's where we get to near the end of the second century.
I totally agree. And it's also the move from, let's say, from classrooms to bishops and to an institutionalized form, where for the first time you get a liturgical approach, and you get a move of these texts into. And so we have these deutero texts. And I think they're derived precisely from around the same time. Yeah. So we have then texts which give us liturgical material for the first time, and so forth, right? We have indications already in Justin, but that's all that we've got, right? But I think it's late second century that we move slowly. And I've always pointed to the fact that when we look into the liturgy is pretty stable in having one gospel and not four. We have it in the Codex Fuldensis, and we have it in the Syriac tradition. Only in the Greek tradition, where Constantine endorses and even obliges the communities to introduce a fourfold gospel and the big New Testament, which I think for a very long time were pieces of works which were used in classrooms, but not in the community meetings, right? At best at symposia.
Yeah, I mean, one little caveat to that, of course, is Eusebius's reference to the Gospel of Peter, right? And when that community contacts their bishop, Serapion, I believe was his name, they ask him, like, is this gospel okay to use? And he says, yeah, that's fine. And then he actually reads it and says, oh Christ, no, don't use it, and that's heretical. But it looks like there's still, even post, that's early 200s. So that's post Irenaeus.
Exactly.
And we still have fluidity about what constitutes a legitimate gospel within a Christian community. Now there, I think it is being used somewhat, maybe liturgically, but maybe not. Maybe it's being used more educational. So like you have, because even like homilies that we get from the 4th century, right? I've been reading 4th, 5th century. I've been reading Augustine's on Serapion for another research project I'm working on right now, and I read his sermons, and they're really cool. But and they quote Bible stuff, and he talks a little bit about it, but really exegeting the scriptures is not his point. That's not what a sermon does. And if that's not true when you have more of a stable canon and that post-Constantinian period, then what would it have been like in a much more chaotic, diverse, dynamic, fluid period before that? So yeah.
With Origen, you have his commentaries on Luke and John are written in the mid 3rd century, so we're now moving quite a ways on. But and correct me if I'm wrong here, Marcus, but I want to say that Origen is the first to really give us evidence of something like a text criticism, where he is collating different texts and looking at different manuscripts and comparing them carefully, which to me suggests that actually these texts are in a very fluid state all the way up to the mid 3rd century, right? If we get the first indications of a careful word by word comparison of different manuscripts only in the 3rd century, then there was nothing like stabilization prior. There was much more playful, performative, and fluid dynamics among all of these texts, and that only, even it's really only with Augustine in the beginning of the 5th century that, and him responding to Porphyry, and well, I guess Porphyry then is probably a good example of that from outside of the community of the contradictions within the texts and across these texts and having to deal with that. But I was going to ask a different question actually about reconstructive tasks. So, Marcus and others have spent a lot of time trying to reconstruct the Marcionite texts to try to get back to these strata that don't live in a self-contained manuscript, but you have to, dig out from these attestations. what in the Valentinian community needs to happen in that regard? Can we, besides Nag Hammadi, which was a huge, an important discovery, can we reconstruct early strata of, of Valentinus, of Heracleon? Has anybody tried to reconstruct, for instance, Heracleon's commentary on John? Is that even possible? If we can reconstruct Contra Celsum from Origen's, treatise against Celsus, can we also reconstruct something like Heracleon's comment? And is that even a worthwhile endeavor to try to get back to these pre-proto-Orthodox strata in the 2nd century?
No, it's a great question, Mark. And I don't think the level of work that you and Marcus have done on the Marcionite material has been done to the Valentinian material. Jeffrey Smith's work on Valentinian Christianity, his source book, is really helpful in presenting that material, and his editions are actually, I think, should be the current go-to on a lot of that material. But a lot of it is basically just lifting material out of what the Church Fathers or other Christian writers have said, and then try to contextualize it and offer translations. I actually think that if we're going to do like a history of Valentinianism much more broadly, I mean, if we even want to continue using the label Valentinian, and I can talk a little bit about that if you like, what we really need to do is we need to start moving beyond a lot of other material and just like start incorporating stuff. Like most people don't really incorporate Origen's references to Valentinus because it's just so brief and like first principles. So why aren't we incorporating that stuff? And so I think we need to kind of look at that material. My one methodological concern, however, is that we may end up doing something similar to what Thomason did in his magnus opus, The Spiritual Seed, and that is we create a trajectory. And he does a brilliant job. He's probably as closest to what you're talking about, though not text critically, more conceptually. But he creates a systematic theology or theologies, because he has like an Eastern early and a Western later understanding of it, and then he nuances those through the text. But that forces us to have that kind of sectarian model, and forcing someone like Valentinus to have to fit into a into what later becomes Valentinianism, and I don't think that's really all that helpful, because I think it distorts. So what I would prefer to do is, I don't know about the text critical aspects about revisiting the primary sources, but I think we also have to almost get rid of the labels. When I published Valentine Ethics and Paradigmatic Discourse, I challenged the category Gnosticism, and for legitimate reasons that I still hold to today. But I raised criticisms about the category Valentinianism, but I said, like following Mike Williams's point, like it's a term which reflects a sectarian group. Reviews of my book misread me and said that, a book review that misread someone? I don't know. But it misread me and said, Tite rejects not only the category Gnosticism, but even goes so far as to reject the category of Valentinianism. And I thought to myself, I never put this in writing, I never put this in the public sphere, my thoughts on this, but I thought to myself, I never did that. I actually supported the idea of using Valentinianism as a label, and then I tried to balance the general category of Valentinianism with the specific particulars of each individual text. But since I read those reviews, I'm almost at the point where I'm like, maybe I should have, because it's not helpful. And it really is a category that's being imposed by opponents. Ptolemy is not a Valentinian.
No.
He's a Christian. He's a Christian philosopher. Valentinus is not a Valentinian. He's not a Gnostic. You
find the same thing later in the Reformed tradition. Like there's James Arminius, and then there's the Arminians, but they are not the same.
And so I think there's better ways of mapping it out that are more dynamic. So that's just how I'm approaching it. It makes it messy, because doing history, like you write your history, like I was thinking about writing a history book, an intro history book, to early Christianity, following some of my ideas. And I was thinking, if I did that, it would be really difficult to organize, because the easiest thing to say is, here is the apostolic fathers, here's Jesus, here's Paul, here's, you know, whatever, right? Here's the apologists, here's, the Gnostics, here's, the Marcionites, here's, whatever. And, even if you do it geographically, but if you have it as a more dynamic process, then it's messy, because you have basically people like what Karen King used the metaphor of a cook in a kitchen, right? When she talked about syncretism, and a lovely article published, I think back in 2001 in Historical Reflections. It predates her wonderful book, What is Gnosticism? And she basically said, basically it's like being a cook in the kitchen, and where you're making something, you're like, I need something. I'll just grab this. I'll grab whatever's near me. And I think intellectually, that's what these people are doing. They're just grabbing what's near them and what works. And as somebody who likes, I'm actually a cook. I love playing in the kitchen. I even teach a course on food and religion. I have a ton of cookbooks in my personal library, but I almost never use them because I'm just constantly just doing this, right? And I think theologically, that's what these people are doing, and our histories need to reflect this, not this.
Okay.
Right, we almost politicize the text, right? We lump these people into almost political identities, right? That are and genealogical identities. When it's what you're reminding me of, the Ciceronian metaphor of the bee going to the flowers, which Basil and later Christians pick up as that is the mode of philosophy, is you're always visiting many flowers, many sources, and pulling from them whatever you find useful for your paranetic. So it's not genealogical at all. It's about being well read, and that means you're in conversation with everybody, and you're pulling from everybody, and you're putting it together in a new way. So I think that chef and cook metaphors is a fantastic way of thinking about these texts. And then the Gospels are doing the same thing, and each new iteration or stratum or whatever is another exercise in that. It's just playfully pulling from all these different things, and it's not the sacred book that is in a very stable form
that's immutable and has to be read the way it is. I mean, I actually unfriended somebody on Facebook. I won't name them in public, but who's supposedly a New Testament scholar. But I question his credentials. But he just going off about the longer ending of Mark and the woman caught in adultery, and basically the subtext of the argument for that, arguing that those belong in the Bible, is because the people who are saying that material doesn't fit are basically anti-Christian. I mean, I'm kind of summarizing it, right? They're basically countering orthodoxy, and I'm like, you're no longer an historian. You're a theologian dealing with modern theological issues, and I'm an historian. I'm a social historian, and my job is not to determine what is truth, especially for people who live in the 21st century, let alone the 20th. My job is to understand as best as I can what was going on in the 1st to 4th century. And that's a scientific process, which means we're always open to new ideas and new evidence and new arguments. Now, that cook in the kitchen metaphor, though, I think is really important to recognize as well. And that is, it's not all about getting along either. Like these ancient writers and ancient thinkers and practitioners, they didn't always get along. They fought with each other. You have conflict. I mean, Justin, Origen, Clement, Valentinus, and Ptolemy all have a lot in common, but they don't agree with each other, and they do attack each other. I mean, we don't necessarily have anything polemical from Valentinus. He may never have been a polemicist at all. He may have been just a really lovely human being. We have no idea. And so we have to recognize that there is conflict and contestation that's going on within these schools of thought, much like with the so-called Sethians. If you follow John Turner's idea of Sethian history, with the the Neoplatonic school of Plotinus, you've got this kind of like pushback, but they're like talking about minutiae about some cosmological primordial entity, and they differ on a name or something like that, and so they're like, well, get the hell out of my house, I don't want to ever talk to you again. And it's like, that's the kind of contestations that are going on, but they're arguing over the same things because they're interested in those topics and they're trying to understand it in the same venue. And that's interesting. The other thing is also to, of course, recognize that, getting back to Marcus's comment, that these are elites. These are well-educated individuals. They don't speak for the vast majority of what might be labeled as Christians in the 2nd and 3rd century. And I think one of the problems of church history is, of course, is that it's always been studied through the lens of our written sources, which come mostly from men. The only one that might be the Diary of Perpetua and the Passion of Perpetua and Felicitas, but I think that's a lot of wishful thinking, unfortunately. And I love that text, of course, but it comes from a bunch of elite, powerful, intellectually well-educated individuals who are coming out of certain schools of thought, whether it's Carthaginian, Rome, Caesarea Alexandria, whatever. And then you have all these other people that are out there. Right. I've studied the martyrdom material like ad nauseum in the last, 10, 15 years. And I love that material. But what I find really fascinating is when you get to I think during the Great Persecution, you get this papyri letter, from Copras, I think is how you pronounce his name. And he writes back to his wife about a business trip that he's on. And he's required to offer sacrifice. And, he's like, ah. So he basically delegates his brother, who's not a Christian, to basically do it for him. It's a very small passing comment. He didn't go to Alexandria to be martyred. He's not there. Hey, I want to die for my faith. He's like, I'm here to do business. Like, come on, this is irritating. This is like paying a toll. And he finds his way around it, right? And I think the vast majority of Christians are living out their normal lives, and we just get to see the extreme examples. So we have to be very careful not to say, whether we're looking at Valentinus or we're looking at Ptolemy, or we're looking at Justin, we're looking at whoever, Marcion even, and just say they represent everyone, whether it's a particular sect or it's the entire, movement that we call Christianity.
Yeah, and I think on that great bombshell, we might just call it a day. And we could talk about this for ages. I mean, we didn't even get into the Gospel of Philip or the first apocalypse of James, and there are some other maybe Valentinian things we could have talked about. And just to add, I mean, someone the other day accused me and Mark of being Vincentians after Marcus Vincent. So we can maybe echo some of the difficulties that Valentinus might find himself in today if he was to come back. Thank you so much for joining us, Phil. It's been a real pleasure, and we hope to have you back again soon. Viewers, we are going to record another video with Phil, so look out for that next Saturday. And to Marcus and Mark, again, always a pleasure. Do check out Phil's book down in the description, and mine and Mark's Patreon and Twitter. It's always good to get more followers and to interact with you more. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, Zach.